In this video I'm going to break down how I made the volcanic eruption animation that you just watched. This video is going to cover a lot of tips about scene creation, particle systems, volumetrics and a bunch of other stuff. This video has been sponsored by Concept D, a new brand for creators brought to you by Acer. They've sent me this Concept D7 SpatialLabs Edition laptop for use in its creation. It's got a glasses-free, stereoscopic 3D screen and loads of other cool features. We'll talk more about that later in this video. So first of all, we need to create an environment that we can destroy. Originally I planned to create a small section of a whole street in Pompeii, but I really love the design of Roman villa courtyards, so I went with that idea instead. First of all, I started by making the tiles for the roof. Now normally I would do this just by using an image texture and a little bit of displacement on a flat plane, but I thought it would be a cool idea if some of the tiles would actually fall off the roof during the animation, and that would be much easier to do if we have some actual separate tiles. So I just model out the shape of one tile and I used two array modifiers to turn it into a whole section of roof. I gave these a photo texture, but one problem that you have when you use photo textures with arrays is that you can see some obvious repetition in the pattern. To break up the repetition, I applied the arrays and I separated each one of the tiles into their own object, and then I added all the tiles to a collection. Now if we plug a separate XYZ node into a combine XYZ node, we can control the individual axes of the texture coordinates, but the problem is that they all move in the same direction because they have the same UV map, so that doesn't actually help to break it up. What we have to do is add in a object info node, and if we take a look at the random output, you can see that every single tile has its own unique value. So now let's take that value and combine it with the original coordinate information using a math node set to add. And what you'll notice that does is it gives every single one of the tiles their own unique coordinate space, so basically it breaks up that repetition. The awesome statue in the centre of the garden was actually a Photoscan from Sketchfab. I rely on Photoscans more and more often these days to quickly get really nice results without having to manually create every single asset in the scene. Here's a few tips when you're working with Photoscans that you've downloaded. Because Photoscans are usually in lots of different pieces, they're often all parented to one empty object. So what you want to do is just go into the object settings for the statue or whatever it is you've downloaded and go to clear parents but keep transform. Then you can delete the empty object from the scene and you won't delete the object as well. Photoscans usually have a ton of random overlapping verts in there that you don't need, so you can just select everything in edit mode and use the merge function by distance to get rid of all the unnecessary data. In this case it reduced down the model by over 100,000 verts, so it's definitely worth doing. You can usually reduce the amount of polygons much further just by adding in a decimate modifier too. The lower number that you type into here, the fewer polys that you'll have in the model. Now you can reduce the poly count by as much as about 80% a lot of the time without having any real noticeable difference in the look or the quality of the scan. I almost always reduce the amount of polys in a scan by at least 50%. Whenever I start a project like this, the first thing I do is I go into Sketchfab and I download just a ton of different 3D scans that might come in handy while I'm creating the scenes. One problem that I have with this is it's hard to figure out which ones are best to use, because you end up with this big folder full of scans and you don't know which one's which. Now Windows does come with a 3D model viewer, but it's really very basic and a lot of the times it just won't accept the 3D scans that you try to load in. So normally what I have to do is I have to go into Blender and I have to just keep importing the files into Blender until I figure out which one's which, and actually which one's a good quality, because some of the scans really don't look very good. Now this time, because I've got this SpatialLabs laptop, I can use its own inbuilt real-time model viewer. I found that it does a really good job of handling high poly meshes, and it's really nice to see the models in 3D without having to wear some clunky 3D glasses. It also has this really interesting feature that I've never seen before. The 3D display works by pointing a slightly different image at each one of your eyes. Now because it's got eye tracking technology built into the laptop, the objects in the viewer can actually change orientation depending on where you're looking from. So what I mean by that is as you move around the laptop, you can actually see the model on the screen from different perspectives. So if you move up above the laptop, then it'll look like you're looking down on the object. I've never seen anything like this before, especially not in a laptop, and I think it's a really unique feature. So to make this whole scene look a little bit more worn out and lived in, I added the simple moss shader that I made a long time ago. If you're a member of my Patreon, you'll already have access to this, and I use it all the time. I've used it in a bunch of videos before. Simple node systems like this are a really great way just to break up some of the repetition, especially if you're using photo textures, or in this case, all of these columns are identical, but you can't tell once I apply that shader. To make the volcano in the background, I had three options. I could sculpt it by hand and try to match the shape of Mount Vesuvius as best I could, but that would take a long time and I'm not really sure how great that would look. I could have also used the landscape add-on that comes with Blender, but one of the problems with that is it's a procedural noise-based system, so it's pretty hard to match the exact look of a mountain that you want to recreate. The third option was to use a 3D scan or some real geographical data of Mount Vesuvius. Luckily I managed to find an actual 3D scan of Mount Vesuvius on Sketchfab, so I just downloaded that and imported it into Blender. Once I scaled that up and dropped it into the background, it just looked like it was way too close. Even if I actually moved it really far back and made it huge, it still looks like it's not in the distance at all. That's because in real life, as things start to move into the distance, a few different things happen. The contrast between the lightest and the darkest value starts to shrink, and also the colours of different objects start to take on the same hue as the sky. Especially a blue sky, because the blue wavelength is less susceptible to scattering as it travels through the air. That's the reason why the sky is blue in the first place usually. So to replicate that effect, I just added a huge cube into the scene, and I removed its shader, and then I added a principled volume shader into the volume input. I just brought down the density so it was really low and I gave it a slightly blue colour. Another trick to make large objects look like they're further in the distance is to use a larger focal length, and also to introduce a little bit of shallow depth of field. Just add an empty into the scene wherever the focal point's going to be and select that as the focal point of the camera. Then you can lower down the f-stop just a little bit until the background starts to go blurry. Whenever you're working on photo scans, you'll often find parts of the textures that are either a little bit glitchy or it's just got things in there that you don't like this path for instance. You can just open up the texture paint tools and select the clone brush, then if you shift click anywhere on the mesh, that'll place down your 3D cursor and that's where you'll sample the paint from. Then you can just paint on like it's a normal brush, and it basically works like the clone stamp in Photoshop or any other graphics program. The texture of this scan was a little bit low resolution, so I just mixed it in with another texture set that I found online. I still wasn't really happy with the final look of the mountain, to be honest, but there was a hell of a lot more work to do at this point, so I decided it was best to just move on. I decided it would be a nice feature to add a little pond around the statue. To make the animated water, I just made a plane and gave it a glass material, then I also gave it a displacement modifier set to a cloud texture. Once you add a few loop cuts and a subdivision surface modifier, you get this nice wavy pattern. Now in order to animate this, I just added an empty object into the scene and I set that as the target of the displacement modifier. That means the pattern of the cloud texture noise will be driven by the position of the empty. So if you move the empty around in 3D space, you can see that it affects the ripples of the water. So now all I need to do is set two keyframes on the empty at different positions. Right now the animation slows down a little bit at the start and the end, but we can fix that just by changing the interpolation of the keyframes to linear. Now you can also press Shift E when you're hovering over the timeline and choose linear extrapolation. What that'll do is it'll just continue on the motion forever, long past, even when it goes past the keyframes, it'll just continue on doing what it was doing. The cool thing about using this method is that you can quickly change the timing of the animation. If you select the second keyframe and you move it closer to the first one, everything will speed up. And if you go the opposite way and you move the keyframes further apart, the whole animation will slow down. To create the plants in the scene, I used an add-on that you've probably seen before if you've watched any of my videos. It's called Botanique. It has this really nice scattering system for grass. It has a lot of different options in there. I went for this wild grass with flowers growing in it, which I thought looked pretty nice. I'll leave a link in the description to Botanique if you want to take a look at that. Making the opening establishing shot of the sun rising above the villa on the morning was actually really easy to do. Blender comes with this really powerful node called the Sky Texture node, and you can actually animate the elevation of the sun to change over time. So all I had to do was set a keyframe when the sun was down, and then set another keyframe later on in the animation so that the sun would rise up to about 8 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Once that was done, I started working on the next shot where there's a few little ground tremors, and I knew that I wanted some of those tiles to fall off the roof. So once that was done, I started working on the shots where there's a little bit of like an earthquake going on caused by the volcano. I knew that I wanted some of the tiles on the roof to kind of shake and vibrate as the earthquake was happening. So I set the origin of each one of the tiles that would move to the back of the tile, then I keyframed the rotation on one of the axes. Then if you jump over to the graph editor, you can add a noise modifier which will just procedurally keep moving the tile up and down on that axis. One of the good things about the noise modifier is you can actually set the frame range as well, so you can say when you want it to start and when you want it to finish. That way it's not just jumping all over the place for the whole animation. Making the tiles actually fall off the roof was a little bit trickier. I had to use Blender's rigid body physics simulation tools, which is a horrible experience at the best of times. I could go on a long rant about everything that I think is wrong with the simulation tools in Blender, but let's just say it doesn't work very well. So once I had animation that looked somewhat passable, I converted that to keyframes. That way I could actually make some changes to the animation and kind of get rid of some of the weirdness. I could group some of the keyframes closer together so that the objects would fall faster, and I could delete all the frames after the objects should stop moving. Using that botanic add-on, I added this tree into the corner. Most of the botanic trees have procedural wind animation, so I applied one of those so the tree would kind of shake around a little bit as the earthquake was happening. Because this was a lemon tree, I realised that if the earth's shaking around this much, some of these lemons should really be falling to the ground. So I just created a lemon really quickly, and I used the rigid body physics tools again just to make all the lemons drop to the ground at different times. To offset the times of when they would fall, you just need to set a keyframe on the dynamic setting for each one of the lemons. All of the fire, smoke and volumetric effects for this video were made using a program called Embergen. I've been waiting for an excuse to play with this thing for a long time. I've seen loads of online demos and it always looks really cool. I didn't really have a lot of time to figure out how this thing works properly, unfortunately. I didn't even have time to watch any tutorials, but it's a procedural, real-time, node-based system for things like fire and smoke. It was a little bit frustrating to use. I don't know how much of that was just because I really was making this up as I went, but considering I had no idea what I was doing, I managed to get some pretty nice effects. Now, while this program is technically real-time, it is still a volumetric simulation that it's running, and they tend to be very heavy, so unless you've got some fairly good hardware, you're probably going to get really slow playback speed. The Concept D7 SpatialLabs Edition has the latest NVIDIA RTX Studio graphics card and the latest Intel i7 processor, so it had no problem keeping up with all the volumetrics I was adding. Once I was happy with how all the volumetric smoke looked, I exported those as open VDB files which I could then import back into Blender. VDB files don't have any materials with them, so you have to make those yourself. But you can export them with all the attributes that you need to make the simulation look good, like density, fuel and temperature. So for the main eruption effect, I used the smoke density attribute to control a color ramp. That would allow me to make the smoke a little bit darker where it's thickest and lighter towards the edges. Then I plugged the temperature attribute into the emission factor, which made the hottest parts glow. Now by default that's way too hot, so I used the math node just to divide that number down to something that was a little bit more manageable. Finally, to get some nice realistic colours, I just plugged in the black body node into the emission colour slot. Even though I used Embergen to make this simulation, the same sort of node setup would work fine with something that you made inside Blender. To make the shot of all the rock hailing down, I just made this really quick rock shape and I used a Voronoi node as the bump factor so it would look kind of like pumice stone. Not that anyone would actually be able to notice the details on the rock, but I couldn't help myself. I added this really big plane above the scene and I made that a particle system, and I set the particles to be the rock object. I also made a quick proxy copy of the whole scene and I just joined it together so that was all one mesh, and I gave that a collision property. That way I could just deal with one collision object at a time and it would affect the whole scene. Now by default, Blender's particles won't actually interact with each other. They don't bounce very realistically either. Now I use this add-on all the time called Molecular, but I don't think it's supported anymore, so I found there's a new version called Molecular Plus. and that just adds a little bit of realism to the simulations because particles can bump off each other and things like that. Since it's supposed to be raining down huge amounts of ash at this point, I made a new node group that I could add to every material and it would automatically give them a layer of ash. To make this, I just plugged a noise texture into a color ramp, and then I plugged that into the color input of the principal shader and I gave that some high roughness. Then I just added a little bit of bump and that gave us the basic ash effect. Now we can add a mix node and we can mix the original material with this new ash material. But that's just going to evenly mix the two, and we want to add the ash just on the top of the objects mostly. So what we can do is we can get a texture coordinate node and we can plug the normal output into a separate RGB node. We can then grab just the blue channel and use that as our mix factor. What that's going to do is basically give us a mask that'll separate just the top of each object. We can push up the black values using a color ramp to get a better idea of what's happening. So we've got some ash on the top but not on the sides. It looks okay, but the transition is a little bit clean and we want it to look more realistic. So what we can do is we can add in a mix node and we can mix the noise texture that we made earlier to colour the ash. Now if we just add in another colour ramp, we can tweak those settings a little bit and we'll end up with a much more realistic effect. You can also play with the settings on the colour ramp to get different effects. Like if you change the colour ramp to constant, you'll get a much sharper edge. I thought that looked pretty cool too. So once that was done, I just selected all those new nodes that we created and I pressed Ctrl and G to add those into a node group. Then I could just go through all the different materials and add the same ash material to every single object. Now, sometimes you render out a scene and then you notice that it's missing something. You want to make some changes or you want to add something to the render, but you don't really want to render out the whole thing again. In this case, I thought it would be cool to have some dust falling down as the earthquake happens from the roof. So I just imported this video clip of some dust falling down and I placed it into the right spots in the scene. I added every single other object in the scene to a new collection and I made that collection a holdout object. Holdout objects act as basically a transparent mask. So for instance, you can see the column here is being cut out of the dust image. Then I just rendered out the whole scene again, and because these are objects in the original scene, they're going to have the same camera motion. I rendered that out with a black background and I brought that back into DaVinci Resolve. Then I could just create that as a new layer on top of the original animation, and I could set it to screen mode, which would get rid of the black, change the opacity a little bit, and it looks like it's part of the original shot. So once everything was finished, it was time to render everything out and do all the compositing. I didn't really make a lot of changes in the compositor, I mostly just tweaked the colours and the values a little bit. I also added a little bit of fog using the mist node. This Concept D7 laptop was perfect for compositing because it's got Pantone validated colours, which basically means it's got really high colour accuracy. Now normally I use a 32-inch TV as my main monitor. It's nice to have a big screen, but I always have to check my renders on another display because the colours aren't very accurate. For instance, in this case, the dark values in the render were way too low and the bright values looked all blown out, so I corrected all that in post. When I checked it on a few other devices, it looked much better. Thanks for watching this video and thanks to Concept D for making it possible. Remember to check out the link in the description to find out more about the Concept D7 SpatialLabs Edition laptop, and I'll see you guys in a few days with another video.